The Christian community at Philadelphia was one of the two churches in the book of Revelation that Christ did not rebuke. The other church was Smyrna. Christ's message to the church at Philadelphia is a message for all the churches through the centuries. When Christian communities remain faithful even though they are insignificant in the world, Christ's encouragement to the church at Philadelphia is also his encouragement for these churches. The book of Revelation will bless every reader and listener. I am doing this series of videos to encourage you to read the book of Revelation for yourself. This series of videos will not answer all your questions, but hopefully you will find some answer to your question. This series of videos is meant to guide you in your reading. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching. The Christian church at Philadelphia was insignificant in the world, but they were faithful to Christ. In Revelation chapter 3 verse 8, Christ acknowledged that the church at Philadelphia has little power, yet they have been faithful to Christ. They did not deny his name. Although the text did not explain the phrase little power, it probably meant their social status in Philadelphia did not have influence on the society. We do not know the reason for their insignificant status. They could be poor, or the believers are slaves, or the number of believers in the community are few in numbers. Therefore, they have little influence in society. Despite being insignificant in society, the believers were faithful to Christ. They obeyed Christ's teaching, and they did not deny Christ. The Christian community at Philadelphia faced some pressure from the Jewish community. In Revelation chapter 3 verse 9, Christ's response showed that he knew what the Jewish community was doing to the Christian. We do not have details of what the Jewish community did to the Christian community. Christ called the Jewish synagogue the synagogue of Satan. These remarks show that the Jews at Philadelphia was opposing God like Satan. By putting pressure on the Christian community to deny Christ, the Jews were opposing God. Christ labeled these Jews as non-Jews. This declaration showed that the Jews at Philadelphia has rejected Christ. By rejecting Christ, the Jews became non-Jews. Only those who believe in Christ are real Jews, even though they are Gentiles. These Jews from the synagogue must have said to the Christian community at Philadelphia that they were wrong to believe in Christ Jesus. The Jews probably were persuading the Christian community to abandon Christ. Despite the pressure from the synagogue, the Christian community continued to obey Christ's teaching. They refused to deny Christ's name. The synagogue is symbolic of any human institution. Satan can use any human institution to pressurize believers to deny Christ. Whenever any human institution has authority to exercise power over people, Satan can weaponize such institution to force believers to abandon their faith. Believers need God's grace to stand firm despite the persecution. Christ assured the believer at Philadelphia that they did the right thing by trusting in him. In Revelation chapter 3 verse 7, Christ identified himself as the Holy One and the True One. These two titles indicate that Christ is God. In Revelation chapter 6 verse 10, these two titles are used to describe God. Christ also identified himself as the gatekeeper of the Davidic kingdom, which is God's kingdom. Coming into this world through the Davidic line, Christ is a successor of the Davidic kingdom, so he holds the key to the kingdom. Christ now can open or shut the door to the Davidic kingdom. Since Christ came to die for Jews and Gentiles, Christ has opened the door not only to the Jews, but also to the Gentiles. No one can shut the door of the Davidic kingdom to the Gentile believers. In Revelation chapter 3 verse 8, Christ reminded the believers that no one can shut the Davidic kingdom from the Gentile believers. The believers in Philadelphia have remained faithful to Christ despite the pressure by Jews to deny him. Christ remembers their faithfulness. In Revelation chapter 3 verse 9, Christ promised to cause the Jews to acknowledge that the Gentile believers were right in believing in Christ. This Jewish community will learn that Christ loved all believers, including Gentiles believers. In Revelation chapter 3 verse 10, Christ promised to protect the believers in Philadelphia from the hours of trials that is coming on the world. The hour of trial referred to an impending crisis that was coming on Philadelphia and the surrounding regions. This hour of trial is not the second coming. The phrase the whole world probably refers to the regions surrounding Philadelphia. Although we do not have further details about this hour of trials, Christ will protect this believer from this crisis. In Revelation chapter 3, verse 11, Christ reminded the believers that he is coming soon. He repeated this statement, "I am coming soon," at the end of the book. This statement refers to his second coming, although this does not mean he is coming immediately. Believers have to wait for his second coming. This coming will be the next big thing that God will be doing in the world. When Christ returns, he will reward believers' faithfulness. Believers will not lose their salvation, but they may lose their rewards. Christ encouraged believers to hold fast to what they believe. Holding fast means that no one will seize their crown, which is the believer's reward. Every faithful believer will have an honored place in God's temple. Since God's temple in the New Jerusalem is God himself, every faithful believer will have a unique and special place in God's presence. Each faithful believer will have God's name and Christ's name written on them. This name symbolizes that they are God's special possessions. While believers must remain faithful, we need God's grace to be faithful. Conquering temptation or persecution does not depend on our human greed to hold fast. The Apostle Peter was sincere when he declared that he would die with Christ. Peter could not remain faithful to Christ when he was confronted. Peter denied Jesus 3 times because he depended on himself to stand firm. Similarly, believers who think that they can stand up in time of temptation or persecution on their own strength are in danger of falling. We need God's faithfulness to grow our faithfulness. God's faithfulness is his grace to all believers. Christ's message to the church at Philadelphia is that he remembers their faithfulness. Their faithfulness will give them a special place in the presence of God. This message of encouragement is for all believers through the centuries. When we rely on God's faithfulness to enable us to be faithful, Christ will remember our faithfulness. If this video ministered to you, give me a thumbs up. Subscribe to this channel so that you will receive notification of new videos. Thank you for watching.